Welcome to Guest of the Year. I'm the host. My name's Mike. This week's setlist curator is Dr. Sue Balter-Reitz. Sue is a professor of communication at Montana State University Billings, president of the Grateful Dead Studies Association, and the host of The Dead of Night on Yellowstone Public Radio. The Dead of Night is a weekly exploration of the universe of the Grateful Dead, featuring interviews with scholars, musicians, music industry insiders, and fans. There's a link to The Dead of Night in the show notes. Welcome, Sue.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here.
This week's prize pack is generously provided by Green Mountain Bluegrass and Roots Festival in Manchester, Vermont. The festival is promoted by former contestant John alongside his wife, Jill. The annual festival features a variety of bluegrass, roots, and Americana music from both icons of the industry and innovative, up-and-coming artists. It features multiple stages, camping, local food trucks, Vermont craft beer and wine, and a magical Green Mountain setting. For an inside look at how the festival operates, check out the episode with John 4/15/24. The festival takes place August 15th through 18th, and tickets are on sale now via the link in the show notes. Thank you again, John and Jill. All right, here's how the game works. We'll play the first part of a Grateful Dead live track, and each contestant will use the messaging system to silently guess which year their performance is from. Contestants who are all on a video conference together can message in their guesses at any time during the clip or in the 10 seconds after it concludes. Whoever is furthest from the correct year is eliminated. The last two deadheads standing will hear 3 tracks, and whoever is closest to the correct years in aggregate wins. We've got our returning champ Aron here with us, and we'll meet the rest of the deadheads in a moment. But first, without further ado, the Grateful Dead. Okay, the guesses are in. It was Dark Star at Adams Fieldhouse, University of Montana, Missoula on May 14th, 1974. Sue, awesome pick to start off the show. Why'd you choose that Dark Star?
So I'm going to start by saying that there was only one show in Montana, and it was a Wall of Sound show. And I'm still just mystified that the Grateful Dead pulled the Wall of Sound from Reno to Billings to Vancouver. And I know they leapfrogged, right? So there were 2 full or maybe 3, depending on who you talk to, setups of the Wall of Sound. But it was this show that got me my start in radio. In 2019, I produced a 30-minute documentary called The Strangest of Places that was an exploration of the Grateful Dead's one show into Montana.
There's no way that hauling a Wall of Sound to Montana for one show is financially prudent, which I guess kind of aligns with what the Dead's ethos was at that time. But why do you think they prioritized going to Montana in particular?
So that's kind of the mystery, and I am actually writing a paper on that right now. I'm doing some interviews with folks to find out what it was like, because, I mean, as Deadheads, we all travel to shows. That's a big part of the experience. When in Montana, you travel, like I was thinking about, I drive 150 miles to see a Dead cover band, and I never even think about it, right? But a lot of people have traveled from Billings to Missoula is 350 miles, and I know hundreds of people who did that. So it's just kind of this weird little mystery in Grateful Dead land.
So how was this show, Sue, in your mind?
Oh, well, so this show was released as Dave's Picks 9. And it's interesting, if you read the liner notes, it was actually considered as one of the first to be Dave's Picks 1. So I think it really stands up. It's also only the second time that the Wall of Sound hit the road. The first few ones were the Cow Palace and Winterland. So I think it was really kind of a good test for it. The show itself is just stunning. I mean, the first set I think has 12 songs, pretty heavy in the cowboy songs as you'd expect, but they end the first set with a beautiful playing in the band. The second set starts with a couple of short songs, and then it goes into a full weather report into this dark star. And the end is just an NFA going down the road feeling band that's just incredible.
Thanks, Sue.
You're welcome.
John was the only one who got it. 74. Nice poll, John.
Wow.
John is 47 from New York. John, how did you pick out 74 there?
Well, I'm a little embarrassed. So one of the things that I think this season's much harder than last season. And one of the reasons that I think this season has become harder is the moderator, the role of the moderator. And when you emailed us who the moderator was going to be, I looked up Sue. I looked up her radio show. I looked up her show about this show. And I was like, if there's a Montana moderator, there is definitely going to be the Montana Wall of Sound show. And I, listened to it. And it's an amazing show. I mean, I think I had heard it when the Dave's Picks had come out, but I listened to it again actually today. And I was like, it's an amazing show because it's got, Mars Hotel had just come out. Blues for Allah had just come out. So it's got this amazing characteristic of like just having a ton of that stuff when it's like still very new and very fresh, with the Dark Stars and there's like a killer Bertha that opens the show. And it was a great show. So I'm a little embarrassed that I'm playing the moderator. You say playing the show. I'm a little embarrassed that I actually did my research, but I had a funny feeling that Sue was going to break out this one.
No embarrassment necessary. Although Sue did email me before and she's like, you should probably not tell them it's me because someone's going to do that. And I'm going to choose the first song. And I was like, of course, Sue, that's a great idea. I will definitely not tell them it's you. And then boom, I just emailed you guys. That's very astute of you, John, and of Sue for seeing it. I'm the weak link here. There's a happy ending to this story, though. I didn't screw anyone because no one's eliminated here. So I'll just say that now. Anyways, John, nice work. You're on to the next round with everyone, as I said. But to tell you how we're getting there, Aron gets 73. Aron is our returning champ. He is 52 from Toronto. Aron, were you trying to decide between 73 and 74?
Yeah. So I'm rarely ever familiar with the show when I hear it on this show. I don't think I've ever said I know exactly what that show is. I'm always digging out for some sort of information. And at first I was like, is this 72? And I really had to sort of listen hard. And then finally, as I become more familiar with 73 shows that I've been listening to a lot for the last few days, I was like, okay, I think this is 73, but there's just that line is so blurry between these years at times.
Sure. So as I said, everyone's on the next round because CJ gets 71 and Jay gets 77. Let's meet CJ. CJ is 49 from Toledo, Ohio. Why 71, CJ?
Well, just a real quick correction. I think since that original email, I turned 50 in January. Thank you. It's been rough, but I'm probably geographically, I would guess the closest to Sue, and I'm just going to shout out my town here, Ten Sleep, Wyoming. As the crow flies, according to Google, I'm 136 miles from MSU Billings. So, and my folks live up there. They're originally from Toledo, and then 10 years ago, when my daughter was 1, they moved up to Billings. So I go there quite a bit. As soon as you said Missoula, I just about wanted to hit myself over the head with something, because I was like, duh, that's 74. And I've listened to that show probably double digits, at least 10 times or more.
Well, you're on the next round, CJ, as is Jay, who gets 77. Jay is 56 from Xenia, Ohio. Jay, why 77? Was it that clean, you thought?
Yeah, I just heard perfection and I was like, oh man. And I'm nervous. Jeez, I didn't realize how nervous I was going to be, but oh well. Maybe the first round jitters is over. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, it just seemed really tight and, no voices and couldn't really tell anything from the guitar tones. And so, yeah. Good job, CJ, tying me.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that Jason's from Wyoming. Well, lives in Wyoming now too. We're both originally from Ohio, so I'm glad we're going on and we don't have to part ways just yet.
Yeah, you guys are pals.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we traveled from Wyoming down to Boulder to see the last, what was that, July 3rd Dead and Company show together last year. So speaking of traveling to see a cover band.
Yeah. That was the Dave Matthews show.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
Right on. Everyone's on the next round. Sue has another great pick. The guesses are in. It was a Spanish Jam at Fillmore East in New York City on February 11th, 1970. Sue, totally original pick there. Tell us about that Spanish Jam.
So Spanish Jam's one of those songs that I never even realized that I just loved until I started doing the show. And it's just this beautiful moment where the band gets to really listen to each other. And I'm going to tell you guys right now, I am not an instrument person, so you should know that I'm not listening for the instruments, I'm listening for the performance. This one happens to be from a show that the Allman Brothers and Fleetwood Mac and a band called Love also played. So on this song, Peter Green and Duane Allman are joining the band. I almost picked the song after it, which is a massive Love Light, but I was afraid that would kind of give it away too much. And on the Love Light, it's Greg Allman and Pig exchanging verses. And I'm really fascinated by the interconnection of the Allman Brothers and the Dead. And I've done some interviews with Alan Paul, who wrote the book Brothers and Sisters, and he turned me on to this show.
Speaking of your show, The Dead of Night, I enjoy how it's not only on public radio, but it feels like public radio. It's patient, it's scholarly. You have that distinct NPR mic, which I've always wanted. And I also love how you just play a lot of Grateful Dead music on the show. And I'm wondering if you could tell us about its genesis.
I'm just laughing because I love the patient word. I've never heard that. So the show came about because during the pandemic, a show called Sound Opinion, which was out of Chicago, went dark. And my station manager had remembered the show that I had done a year before. And so he approached me and asked if I'd be willing to put together a show. But he said we couldn't just do music. He wanted something different. So I thought about that a little bit, and I looked around and I kind of looked at what was out in the radio sphere, and there was David Gans and Gary Lambert's Tales from the Golden Road, which is all talk and interview, and I love it. It's a very newsy show, but also very familiar and community building. And then Jesse and Rich Mahan Jesse Jarno and Rich Mahan had just started working on the Good Old Grateful Dead cast, which is an incredible research show. And so I thought, well, there's really nothing in the, kind of in the landscape of Grateful Dead radio that puts the two of them together. And I was really, really lucky because David Gans has been a patron of the show from day one. And so I ran some ideas by him, and he was really supportive. Because I work for public radio, I can play full songs. For folks who podcast, they are limited into how much of a song that can be played without running into music rights issues. And so that really helps. And for me, being a Deadhead, it is all about the music. So I couldn't see a show that wasn't more music than talk. And then from my academic point of view, I'm always interested in trying to help folks understand what makes the Grateful Dead unique, special, why, we're going on Grateful Dead 60 next year, why it's something that's worth the hour that people so generously give me every week.
Thanks, Sue. 2 people got it exactly. John and Jay, they both got 70. Jay, nice poll. How'd you figure out it was 70?
Mainly the guitars seem that year, that primal sound, and the drums and the recording quality. But yeah, that's what just popped into my head and I went with it.
Nice. Way to go. John, what gave it away for you? 70.
I really like those shows. I love the kind of 2 organ-y eras of the Dead, like the 70 and the 90. Like I think they're really some of my favorite stuff to listen to, like Harper College and the Fillmore shows and stuff like that. So I almost fell flat on my face and said, Sue's trying to trick us by bringing Brent in. But then like Jay, the guitar tone brought me back to the Lower East Side in the early 70s. So it was that organ that really made it for me.
Thanks, John. You're on to the next round. Joining you is Jay's pal CJ, who gets 69. Our returning champ Aron gets 68. CJ, why 69?
So I heard a lot of organ work in there, and I got focused on that, and it seemed a little too lively for Pigpen for some reason. Obviously, it must have been, though, because TC left the band the previous month.
Way to go, CJ. Aron, our returning champ, 68.
Well, I did one thing that I told myself I would never do. As I said on the last show, I go with my gut. Like the first date that pops in my head usually is the one that I go with. And 69 was what popped in my head. And the last second when the music started fading, I put in 68.
Do you want to plug Dad Rock Dead one more time?
Sure. So there's 2 sort of Dead related things that I do creatively. One is I started many years ago. I started a dad blog just about living in a big city with kids, and I was talking about relationships and kids, and my upbringing and and my story about a bunch of things, and I got sort of bored of that, and then I started writing very similar thing, but only about my experience with Dead shows and my opinions on the Dead and things like that. So I periodically, not as often as I'd like, I write a blog called Dad Rock Dead, and that's just at dadrockdead.com. And the other thing I do is on YouTube, something that I again have laid down and will be picking up very soon again is I learned to play bass when I first heard Phil Lesh. I played in a Dead cover band, and there was 3 guitars, and I drew the shortest straw and I had to play bass. But what I realized that I actually love the instrument, and Phil Lesh was my teacher, and he's a pretty fucked up teacher, a good one to have, I'd say. And so what I've done is, I've always played Dead songs on both guitar and bass, but what I started doing in, about midway through the pandemic was I started putting 4 shows from a day in Grateful Dead history. So it was always the next day. And I asked my followers to pick one of those songs out of that show. And then I would play it. And then I would play my version of bass on top of those. So I did about 40. I have about 30 to go, and I call it Playing with the Band. So if you're interested, you can either find Aron Harris on YouTube, and that's pretty much the only thing I have up there, or you can do a search for Playing with the Band.
I'll put both the Dad Rock Dead and the YouTube channel in the show notes so everyone can click directly. Thank you, Aron. Really appreciate you. Excited to have you back for the Tournament of Champions.
Can't wait.
CJ, Jay, and John are on to the next round. Sue has another awesome pick. The guesses are in. It was Foolish Heart at Memorial Stadium in Seattle, Washington on May 25th, 1995. Sue, cold-blooded pick and a really nice Foolish Heart. Tell us about that one.
So this is actually the most personal of my picks. My husband, who is right on the bus with me. In fact, he's the one who's pulling me on the bus into the last couple of years. When I told him I was going to be on the show, I asked him what he wanted to pick. So it's his pick, and I never let him pick anything for my radio show because he likes the weird stuff. And it's like, that's not the point of the show. The point of my radio show is not the weird stuff. So I'm like, well, Paul, you can get as weird as you want. And he went for Foolish Heart, which is just like the sweetest thing ever. But it's because it's a show we saw together. It was one of the last shows we saw. I think there was one more show after this that we went to because they had a 3-night run in Seattle in 95. And he just remembered how much he loved it. And it goes from here to Victim of the Crime, which I love also. And I thought about the victim, but again, kind of doing I don't want it to be too easy thing. It's like Foolish Heart was played for a lot of years and Victim not so much.
I'm always fascinated by how people listen to shows by themselves, and especially fascinated when they're with their, friends or loved ones or partners or husbands. How do you guys enjoy the Grateful Dead together?
That's a really interesting question, Mike. I'm not sure how to answer. So, when we were young, so my husband and I have been together now for 38 years, 37 years. And actually, we just always, music was part of our life. It's part of the background of our life. It ended up, I didn't get to see my first Grateful Dead show till 91, but that's because we had tickets when Jerry was in his diabetic coma. There were a couple of times we couldn't get off work, which is just an awful, awful story. And I always tell my students never to let things like that get in their way. But, we've always listened together. We've always just spent time. We travel to concerts. That's what we do for fun. And we just really love to be together in the context of music, which is kind of a weak answer. I don't know that I can explain it better.
No, it's beautiful. That's so lovely. Yeah, that was a great pick, and it was weird. And this is the place for weird picks. These people are always up to the task, and these guys definitely were. The closest was CJ, who's on to the finals. He guessed 93. CJ, why 93?
Vince was all over it, so that definitely narrows it down. Jerry Solo was pretty good. I think he had some pretty good throughout that era. Some, maybe we're a little bit off, but it was just hard to narrow down more than just that mid-90s era.
You're on to the finals. Joining you is John, who guessed 91. Jay guessed 90. John, why 91?
It's funny. It's a great pick. My first show was in 94. So I always feel like these shows get a little bit of a bad rap. There are some real clunkers, but there are some just moments of beauty. I knew it was Vince, and then I thought I heard Bruce. I thought I heard some high grand piano. And so, that kind of got me into like 91, 92-ish, and just, went with 91. I did not think that it was 95. I think Bruce was on some 95 shows. I think he played like RFK or a couple of other shows, but, great show. And I'm definitely going to go check it out, because anytime I can find good 95, it takes me back and to being a high school kid driving my parents' Jeep to the Nassau Coliseum. So that's, good times.
Jay, you must have heard the same thing as John, 1990.
Yeah, I couldn't really get much out of the keyboards. I was listening. I was like, man, I couldn't really hear what was going on. But yeah, it sounded 90s to me, except, it's like, who's playing keys, and just couldn't pick it out.
Sure. Jay, how'd you get into the Dead?
I'm actually, even though I'm an old fart, I'm kind of new to the Dead. I like the last decade or so, they really started going down the rabbit hole. And like 7 years ago, I got a job where I was away from my family, so I had my evenings to myself, and I started listening to the Dead, and it's like, man, why haven't I gotten into this before? I saw them in the 80s. 88 was my first show. and I liked it, but I was always into, I guess, a more range of rock and stuff. And since then, I'm sold. That's what I listen to pretty much 95% of the time.
Okay, so you're away from your family, not a lot to do after work, so you just go home and pop on a Dead show?
Yeah, and I just would listen, and I started reading the books that were available, and I started getting into podcasts then too, and started listening to a lot of podcasts about the Dead, and and like everything was available, like re-listen. I found out about all this other stuff, and all the various ways to learn, and it just took over. I used to be a really big bluegrass head, and I loved Old and in the Way, and I knew, Jerry's like, man, how many banjo players are also rock guitar legends, I've always been into rock and roll. I was one of those, 80s metalhead, but I'd always liked rock and roll. And yeah, I love the podcast, Mike. You're doing a great job, and thanks for everything you do for this.
Oh, thank you, Jay. And wait, before you go, how do you know CJ?
We actually have known each other for how long, CJ? Like 20 some years. We're how do we describe what we do? We're field ornithologists, I guess. So we met doing bird surveys, and we still do that stuff and make money. And yeah.
Where are you guys in Wyoming?
And I'm in Lander, but I'm working now near Rawlins. I've worked near Casper. I move around a lot. I was away out, Sue, you know where Baker is? I was working out there the last couple of years, so I was in Montana.
I do. And actually,
that's real Wyoming.
My
That's
husband
hardcore.
and I met in Laramie, so we're Wyomingites too.
Nice. Yeah, it's beautiful country.
Wow. Okay, sorry, Jay. I know you're about to go, but so you guys are both field ornithologists.
Mike, thank you for asking. On behalf of the listeners, thank you for asking.
I couldn't let that one slip. Can you tell us more?
I don't know, CJ, is that what we are? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's like we love being outdoors. We have, I guess, good ears for good sound, and so we're both good ear birders. We can pick out individual species, and so it's like, ecology. Translate that to Grateful Dead. It is music ecology. Yeah, just it all blends together, and you can pick out things from it, and it gives you a certain feeling.
So you hear birds before you see them often?
Oh yeah, most of the bird work I've been involved with, 90% of the data we collect is just hearing alone.
Is there Shazam for birds?
Yeah, Merlin. It's called Merlin.
So like you capture a chirp and it'll tell you like
download the Merlin app from Cornell Lab of Ornithology.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, when you're on the field. It's getting really good.
I'm imagining like a Charlie Miller, taper type microphone that you take out. Is that what you use?
I do have a shotgun microphone. I haven't been using it lately, but you can just get great recordings just with your iPhone. And that's what you use with Merlin. And I did buy recently an adapter for my shotgun microphone that plugs right into my iPhone. Recently, I was having a conversation with somebody, and I don't know how we got into this, but they're like, if you had to choose between losing your sight or your hearing, what would you choose? And I think I might go with being able to hear.
Why is that?
So I can listen to the Dead and the birds.
Well, Jay, I could ask you probably 35 more bird questions, but thank you, though, Jay. I appreciate you coming on just here, and fascinating story there. Thank you.
All right. Good luck, CJ. Good luck, John, too. Yeah, I'm not going to, but yeah.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, it's the finals. Both these guys are going to hear 3 tracks, and whoever is closest to the correct year in aggregate over the 3 tracks wins the Green Mountain Bluegrass and Roots prize pack. Let's hear Sue's first pick of the finals. So it was Not Fade Away at the Oakland Alameda County Coliseum on January 13th, 1980. Sue.
So 79, 80 are my secret years that I just love, and hardly anyone talks about those years. And this one is actually, I mean, this is where I'm kind of tricky. You've got two guests here, Carlos Santana and John Cipollina, and it's just beautiful. And one of the things I absolutely adore about the Grateful Dead is it's almost, so I almost think of them like the Borg, right? They will assimilate, but they don't just assimilate, they let the guests take them into different directions. And I was listening back to that, and I think it was Santana's guitar that I was kind of really focusing in on at the very end, and just listening to the graciousness that Jerry gives to his guests and letting them take the lead. And I've seen that in shows as well. And of course, in those late 90s shows, Jerry was often leaning on Bobby and Phil and the keyboardists. So you kind of see that anyway. But in these early shows where he's just in his prime and he's just so generous with the time. The other thing that's interesting about the show is it's a benefit for Cambodia. And the Grateful Dead are often pinged for not being political enough because early on they wouldn't take a stand on Vietnam. But all through their career, they played benefit concerts. And so this is one that really stands out to me.
Sue, you're clearly a scholar. And you actually, as I mentioned at the beginning, you are the president of the Grateful Dead Studies Association. Could you tell us a little bit about your role and the association itself?
Sure. So the Grateful Dead Studies Association is an organization whose goal is to help understand the Grateful Dead from a variety of perspectives. And so they use the word interdisciplinary, which means we've got folks from music, art, communication, sociology, psychology, philosophy, literature, geography, economics. I mean, just any course you could take in college, there's somebody who teaches that, who studies it from the point of view of the Grateful Dead. And by bringing this knowledge together, you really learn a ton, not just about the music, but about the cultural milieu. That's a fancy word, about the culture and the context in the community. So my perspective is communication. I first started thinking about it from, my actual, like where I spend most of my time and do most of my research is in the First Amendment. So the first thing I ever studied in Grateful Dead studies was actually the Grateful Dead's willingness to allow tapers, which is unusual because there's a, copyright and intellectual property, but it's not a, black and white, nuanced choice because the Grateful Dead were very methodical about shutting down bootleggers when they could. So there's this really interesting there's a mythology about if the quote that's attributed to Jerry, it's like, once we've played it, we don't need it anymore. The music's theirs. But the truth is, as long as it wasn't competing against them in the marketplace, right? So I start there, but then I started looking at kind of representation and thinking about how is it that the culture thinks about the Grateful Dead and Deadheads? And in 2015, during Grateful Dead 50, suddenly the light was shining on the Grateful Dead. And, there's almost like a switch in the mythology of the Grateful Dead. But back to Grateful Dead studies, you take my point of view and you add it to all these other ways that people are thinking about the Grateful Dead, and you get this incredibly rich picture about this band that, we're still talking about, like I said, almost 60 years past their first show.
So how does the Grateful Dead's relationship with the First Amendment continue evolving after they, tacitly to overtly allow taping?
So the tacit allowing became an actual allowing. But then, in 1995, when the Grateful Dead dissolved, this is kind of the rise of the internet and the beginning of archive. And tapers had always shared, and tapes got better and better, and distribution got better and better, and it was easier for folks to upload and download. And I can't remember the exact year that the Grateful Dead realized that the archive was competing with their ability to sell CDs. And so they put a cease and desist on archive.org. And it's called the Thanksgiving Day Massacre because it happened right around Thanksgiving. And at that point, I mean, there was just this incredible backlash. And so the Dead actually went backwards and said, okay, streams for soundboards, you can download audiences, which is still true. And of course, now streaming is everywhere. The archive's not such a big deal.
Fascinating. So thank you. John was closer. He guessed 88 and CJ guessed 70. John, you kind of nodded when Sue said Santana. Do you think it was one of the sit-ins from 88?
No, not at all. I was like, I was totally confused. The 80s are the hardest for me. You know, a lot of people will talk about like the plinky keys, but Brent played a lot of organ the whole decade. Like he played it more later in the decade, but he wasn't always playing plinky keys. So I think he's playing organ there. So I kind of mentally went, okay, if I have to break the 80s up, this is late 80s. And the quality was pretty good. And I thought it was Jerry and Bobby. I didn't think it was Santana and whoever the other guest was Sue mentioned. So I was kind of like, oh, they're shredding. The quality's pretty good. It's Hammond B33. This is late 80s. I was totally confused. Totally confused.
All very reasonable points. CJ, 1970.
Yeah, so the speed of that right away told me, right, this is not a, Closing to Winterland. It's not a bone, right? This is a very speedy, and I should have, added the cocaine to that and, gone more 80s than early 70s. But, yeah, I did not pick up the Santana. But yeah, I just came to that fork and I'm like, get far away from, that 77, 78. And I went the wrong direction.
Totally get it. Well, CJ, before we go on to the next round of the finals, how'd you get into the Dead?
Oh, great question. So I remember, ordering tickets on Ticketmaster for Lollapalooza 92 and hearing that the remaining shows of the Grateful Dead's tour had been canceled. So I was talking to a couple of friends of mine that, that were into them, and they said, man, yeah, I hope they come back. You should really see a show one day. Well, then when I went to college, I had a roommate, actually it was just a dorm mate at the time, Dave, and he had tapes and he had CDs and he had a little bit of everything. So I started listening to it pretty heavily. And the following spring, 93, they came to Cleveland, and that was the famous Blizzard show. I think there was 2 nights scheduled. The first one was snowed out, and I think we only had tickets to the second night. What's so cool about that show is obviously it was my first show, but it was played in Cleveland, right? Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They played I Fought the Law as the encore. And I remember saying to Dave, like, I had no idea they played I Fought the Law. I mean, that's out of left field. He said, yeah, I didn't either. And it might have been years later, found out that was the debut of that song. So we saw the Dead play it for the first time ever. So that's kind of my, I guess, origin story right there.
Cool. So when in your Deadhead journey did you become an ornithologist?
I technically never really became an ornithologist. I think I'd have to have some advanced degrees. I have a degree in geology, which is taken me a lot of places, but not in the field of geology so much. Over time, just my love for birds, my interest in it, and skill at it got me a decent amount of work. Going out there and doing surveys and being able to detect and record every bird that I could see and hear. And sometimes it's really complicated. Just like all these sounds right that we're hearing. Different contributors to a jam, whatever. The same thing goes on ecologically, especially in the spring and summer breeding season for birds, here in the Northern Hemisphere. So we're just now getting into that. And we got new birds showing up every day. I was listening to music through these noise canceling headphones the other day out on my deck, and I heard our first chipping sparrow sing.
See, I'm so naive. I thought it was mostly visual. And so I was like, oh man, what a great opportunity to throw on some Dead. But clearly you got to be out there in complete silence, right?
Yeah. And by yourself and, dressed kind of not in camo, but, kind of muted colors. You don't want to, come charging into a bird's habitat and, make a ruckus because they'll react to that. So you just want to very calmly move through the habitat. But, yeah, one other thing I was thinking of is that there are ornithologists, who do a lot of very technical work, that do banding work. So they actually put up these mist nets in the habitat and they capture birds temporarily and they take very precise measurements, of their belly. There's a thing called a brood patch. So, if that bird is a female who's possibly incubating incubating some eggs or young birds, things like that. So that's the real detail stuff. And to me, that's the people who know the guitar tones when they hear a Grateful Dead song, and they can tell you exactly what guitar and exactly what year and sometimes exactly what show. And so what I'd say where I'm coming from is more of that, I'm in the forest and I hear a kind of a cacophony of things, and I'm kind of picking things out throughout that soundscape, but I'm not getting so detailed where I have a bird in hand and I know every little thing about it.
Man, I was hoping you connected to the Dead like that, but I didn't know how to ask the question. So thank you for just doing it. So cool, CJ. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, John has a 2-point edge right now going into the second song of the finals. Let's hear Sue's next pick. The guesses are in. Here Comes Sunshine at Oakland Alameda County Coliseum on December 17th, 1992. Sue, a late era Here Comes Sunshine. Beautiful pick. Tell us about it.
So this is another one of those songs that, as I've started to put the show together, it's a song that I just never connected to. And now I listen to it a lot. And I knew if I picked, they only played this like 30 times. So it was either going to be 73 or 92, 93. So I figured if I picked the 73, it would be too easy.
Thanks, Sue. They both guessed 93. CJ, why did you guess 93?
Opener, my first show in Cleveland, and it was another one I didn't know that they were going to do or had done. Of course, as my understanding, Vince helped them bring it back, and they started that a cappella harmony to kick it off. And so my first show, I did not hear a guitar note or a drum note. I heard "Here Comes." I mean, I heard all that whole thing, and once they say it, you're like, "Oh, that's the song," and then they bust in. So when I thought first show, first song, 93, boom, 93, and what did you say it was December?
Yeah, it was December 17th, so pretty close.
Yeah.
John, you also guessed 1992. What'd you make of that track?
It was good. And Summer 93 is actually pretty good. There was another episode of your show, Mike, where there was this bootleg CD that was kind of going around in the 90s of the Autzen Stadium. I think it's 8/21/93. And I don't think Here Comes Sunshine is in that show. I don't remember, but like they were pretty good. Summer 93, they were good. And I kind of was like, well, it's a pretty good Here Comes Sunshine. Maybe it's from that tour. Give it a shot. I guess CJ and I only missed by 14 days, right? So
yeah, and that must have been Steve. He stands 93 really hard, especially those Autzen shows. But John, how did you get into the Dead?
I was friends with a bunch of Deadheads. My buddy Greg, his sister, had taken him to shows like when he was in 7th grade. So he actually saw like Brent. He was like the only one of us to see Brent, which was like gave him kind of godlike status. We used to like listen to tapes and shows in his basement because we were so cool. Like everybody else was out like partying and we were like sitting in the basement shooting pool, listening to the Dead. But I was like never convinced. I was kind of like, okay, like, I like Zeppelin, I like the Stones, like whatever. And then I went to my first show, 3/23/94, and I was just hooked. The thing that really solidified it for me is I went to college outside of Philly the following year, and I started trading tapes, both in IRL and on Rec Music G Dead, which I don't think people have really talked about, but there was this really vibrant Usenet community called Rec Music G Dead. And there was just a bunch of us who, it was like an old fashioned news group, kind of like what a Google group is now. There were thousands of people on it. And, as a noob, right? They used to call us noobs. As a noob, you could seed your taper collection by like, if you sent somebody like 3 Maxell XL290s or TDK SA90s, those were the two kinds of tapes that were acceptable. They would send you back one recorded tape. And that was how I like seeded my collection. Like I didn't have any tapes, but I had feet. I worked on campus as a tour guide and, was making $7 an hour, which was a lot of money in those days, and used my money to buy blank tapes, send them around the US and built up a really good tape collection. And then once you amassed a list, you could trade 1-for-1 with people. So, when you were just accumulating, I think the economy was like 2 or 3 blanks got you one show. But then once you had shows, you could trade 1-for-1. And there was no archive then, right? Like, my first year of college was dial-up, right? We got broadband then my sophomore year, but my first year of college was dial-up. So there was no archive. Like it wasn't just like you could go, right? You had to have the tape. So I had my dead bass and I would be like, oh, like I really like Scarlet Begonias. Oh, look at this. In like 1974, they didn't play Scarlet Fire. They played Scarlet into It Must Have Been the Roses in Missoula. Let me find somebody who has the Missoula show and see if he wants or she wants one of my random tapes. And that was like how you grew your tape collection. This is just like so ridiculous, but like there were some people who would not accept TDK SA90s, right? Like, and they only would accept, Sue is nodding, by the way. There are only people who would accept Maxell XL290s. And the TDKs were probably like, I don't know, like 10 cents cheaper or something like that. So like, it was like, oh, like I gotta buy the Maxells because I won't be able to get like all the tapes I want if I send TDKs. And I actually was kind of like a contrarian and I was like, oh, like I think the TDKs sound better, like, et cetera.
Did the message board itself get a little tribal between the haves and the have-nots, the noobs and the tape havers?
No,
okay.
No, it's a good question. I mean, you can go on Google Groups. It's Google bought like the entire Usenet archive maybe 20 years ago. You can go back and look, right? I don't know, maybe Sue does, some of her research there. But you can go look. You can find me, like, and there was like a currency, like, there was an established currency. There were rules, and you followed the rules. Where I thought you were going to go was like, did it get tribal about whether like this show was good or that show was good? And absolutely, right? Like, absolutely. Like, like I think one of the things, especially after Jerry died, that is just so sad is like, there were a whole crew of people who just like couldn't enjoy, like they literally would buy tickets to the shows in the 90s and they couldn't enjoy it because it wasn't as good as the 70s and the 80s. And those fights like played out on the boards, right? Like, oh, like, last night's show was like that Here Comes Sunshine was terrible. Like, I don't know why you guys are saying it was good. And I think, now I just think about like how lucky we all were to actually, see Jerry live, right? I mean, it just, amazing, right? And that's why I go to see Dead & Co. Like, is Dead & Co, I mean, John Mayer's amazing and, I love going, but also like, you only get one go round. You might as well go see all the good music you can,
Thanks so much, John. And Sue, last but not least, how did you get into the Dead?
Okay, so my mom was a record collector and I grew up in the mid 70s. So I'm 60 this year. So I was born in 64. And my mom had bought Europe 72 and my brother and I just played it and played it and played it. And I just loved it. But then I kind of got into the punk scene. I was a New York City kid. So John, I got that connection. I got the Wyoming connection and the New York connection. And I kind of moved away from the Dead, but it wasn't like a purposeful moving away. Just I was listening to punk. Then I got to college, and one of my really good friends, who I was in broadcasting, and a really good friend of mine was a Deadhead. And so he kind of pulled me back in with some really cruddy tapes. And I remember his name's Rodney Brown. I've got to give him a shout out. Rodney would just play these tapes until they were just ragged, but they were good at one point. And he had been at the show, so he had those memories. But I just, kind of didn't get it until I started hearing those better quality tapes. My husband had some good tapes that he had gotten, and I still remember, the trades that happened. And luckily, I was in a community where people were just gifting tapes to each other. One of the first tapes that I got was Cornell. So I was, those Betty boards that created the myth that Cornell is the best show ever. And it's a pretty good show, but I would put a few other shows up there for the money. And so, yeah, this whole taping culture is really important, but it's also the way the music spread. But the Mixell thing is a big deal because one of the ways that I got a lot of tapes was there was a little hippie store in Portland, Oregon called Think Good Thoughts. And they had a massive tape collection. And if you bought tapes from their store, you could record, they had dual tape decks, and you could bring the tapes back and pick a few shows and then go out and play around. I think it was double speed, so it wasn't a purist thing. And they only sold Maxells.
Sue, you kind of explored the Dead as an academic. Why is the band such a versatile lens through which to see America and investigate America?
Wow, that's such a good question. And that's also shorthand for I'm buying time while I think of how to answer this. So there's a lot of reasons, right? I mean, I think the first thing is that, the time and place, the connection, the roots, San Francisco. I'm just listing because I think to try to explain all these would take the next, 20 years. But if you just put them culturally in the middle of the narrative of the 20th century, right? And thinking about their frame, right? So they grow up in post-war America. They're in San Francisco, which is a place that's growing and has its own kind of culture. And it's Peter Richardson writes a lot about this. And if you haven't read No Simple Highway, it's just an excellent book that addresses a lot of these questions. But then, I mean, musically, they're stunning. They're different. They reject most of the traditional narratives of what it takes to be a rock star. They never really sell records, but people adore them. They trek across the country for 30 years. The lead guitarist dies. How many keyboardists die, right? So usually if you lose a single member of the band, that's it. Like you're done. But they continually lost and got members. Then Jerry dies. They take like a couple of years off and then they're back in different configurations and it's still going, right? I think that, just longevity is enough, but they've now seen half of a century of America, and the people around them have grown around them. The culture's grown around them. I mean, there's just too many things to kind of parse out. But luckily, there's a lot of people trying to figure it out.
Well, thank you, Sue, for being one of those people and leading an organization of those people. John has a 2-point advantage going into the third song. Let's hear Sue's pick. The guesses are in. It was Birdsong, shout out CJ&J, at Fox Theater in Atlanta on November 30th, 1980. Sue, tell us about that Birdsong.
So first of all, both that show and this song are two of my favorites. The Fox Theater, if you haven't heard, is just stunning from end to end. But when I produced the show, Mike asked me about putting the show together. the last question I ask every guest is, what song would you really like to have? Is there a song that you just have to have in a show that you are the star of? And Birdsong is probably the most popular song that comes up.
Do you have a sense for why that might be?
For me, what I love about Birdsong is it's just the optimistic, just beautiful, and it's kind of from, something like a bird with her and her sings. It's Hunter dedicates it to Janice, so there's kind of that connection to the history and to the counterculture and to Janice's incredible relationship. But it's beautiful, it's light, and I think it's too funny that I picked it for CJ and Jay.
Yeah, I was hoping we would get to it. Beautiful pick, Sue. Thank you. John guessed 87 and CJ guessed 84. So CJ wins. Congrats to you both.
Way to go, CJ.
Thank you, John. You were a very skilled opponent for sure. You know a lot. So yeah, I appreciate listening to what you had to say.
Yeah, both of you guys were fantastic. CJ, why 84?
Well, got a little water in my eyes. There's a lot of pollen this week here in northern Wyoming, so it could be that, but also just the bird, the bird song. Just definitely it was an 80s bird song. I mean, that's what I first heard, and so I started. I'm gonna go into some bird analogies here. I started kind of fluttering around, from the mid 80s either direction. To me, there's not a bad bird song, and if I could just give one more quick bird analogy to tie it in with the music, so. Ranges, right? Like a range of a species. For instance, there's some that range from coast to coast, north to south, like American robin. I'm sure everybody, whether they know it or not, has probably seen an American robin. And then there are some that are just very much Western species and some that are very much Eastern. And there's a where they come together. And I live kind of right there, the Bighorn Mountains in northern Wyoming. So there are Great Plains species on the east side of the Bighorn Mountains that might be very rare, but slightly overlap into the west side of the mountains where I live, and vice versa. And so if you think of it in terms of like a bird song or a Playing in the Band, which had a 24, 25 year span, and now overlap that with two things that barely overlap each other. So like a Brother Esau and a Lazy Lightning Supplication, right? So you're in a very narrow range there in the early mid 80s. And there are, I looked this up last year, a handful where you can hear both of those, Brother Esau and Lazy Lightning Supplication. And I have not overlaid those also with birdsong or Playing in the Band, but that would be cool to do also. So yeah, the songs have ranges just like birds have ranges, and people might recognize some more than others based on what they've heard or where they're from. And yeah, that ties the birds and music together.
You could probably make 100 more bird analogies and they'd all be as impressive and interesting as that one. Thank you, CJ. Congratulations. And John, 87.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I said it before. First of all, I would say poetic justice, right? If you're going to lose on a bird song, lose. CJ had to win, right? On a bird song, CJ had to win. So I whiffed big, but it's an honor to go out to a birder on a bird song.
John, thank you. Total pleasure chatting. Appreciate you.
Yeah, listen, Mike, thank you so much for doing this. And I've been playing this game in my head and in front of my wife and kids for years before you even did it. Like, I'd be listening to Sirius, and my wife would be like, my wife is not a deadhead. I mean, she's obviously has to listen to a lot of Dead because of me. And we named our daughter Althea, so that and Lucy would be very mad if I didn't mention her as well. So, but I used to sit in the car next to her and be like, "Oh, this is 82," and David Gans would come on and be like, "And that was 82." So when your show came out, she was like, "You have to be on this," and so thank you for bringing this amazing thing that we've all been doing for years. Like, thank you for bringing it to real life, Mike. Like, it's a really great achievement. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. And it's a total pleasure, especially on nights like tonight where everyone's just so fascinating and so cool. And it's been such a great hang. I appreciate you coming on, John and CJ. Great run. And Sue, the catalyst behind all these great conversations. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your picks.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. This was so fun.
Congratulations again to CJ and great run, John. Thank you to Sue for her lovely picks. Again, you can check out The Dead of Night via the link in the show notes. Thank you to John and Jill over at Green Mountain Bluegrass and Roots Festival. Again, it's August 15th through 18th in Manchester, Vermont. Tickets are available via the link in the show notes. One more thing John mentioned, I remember, is that all the musicians jam together too. And that's actually something he and Jill consider when they create the festival lineup. Is like, who wants to jam together? So, sounds incredible in a bucolic setting. Thank you again, John and Jill. And thank you so much for listening. For all the show links, including our YouTube channel, go to guesttheyear.net. If you want to be a contestant on the show, sponsor the show, or make comments and ask questions, email us at info@guesttheyear.net. Shout out to Dylan for drawing the poster and James and Jack for helping out behind the scenes. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks to the amazing tapers whose recordings made this show possible. Big ups to CJ on the win, and to our other contestants, thanks for playing, and remember, it is all one song anyway.
And I bid you good night, good night, good night. And I bid you good night, good night, good night.